Good morning, everyone. My name is Crosby Kemper. I'm the director of the IMLS, the Institute of Museum and Library Services. We are a charter sponsor of the National Book Festival, one of the great book events of the year in this country, and very grateful for your attendance. I have the honor to introduce two of the people who are among the greatest presenters of narrative in America today. David Rubenstein, also a primary sponsor of the National Book Festival, has become one of the icons of American history in his interview programs that have become the books, The American Experience and The American Spirit. In his PBS program, Icons of America, visiting local places that have national symbolic importance, such as Fenway Park and the Hollywood sign in Hollywood. David has certainly been a key to what, in one of his interviews with Jill Lepore, Jill Lepore says, a nation is made up of its people, but it's held together by its history, by the stories we tell. And David has been one of the masters of presenting that story through his interviews with historians and American leaders. He is going to be interviewing David Grann today, and David Grann is a master narrative historian. Many of you will have read The Lost City of Z or Killers of the Flower Moon. Killers of the Flower Moon has been described as a great social history disguised as a thriller or detective story. And his new book, The Wager, is of the same ilk. And so it's a great honor and pleasure to, as I say, present two of the people in this country most responsible for telling our story, our stories, in brilliant ways. Ladies and gentlemen, David Grann and David Rubenstein.
So, thank you very much for coming here.
You've
been to the National Book Festival before?
I have. I was fortunate enough to be here a few years ago for Killers of the Flower Moon.
So, let's talk about how you became a writer first. Were you a great athlete in high school or something like that?
You take one look at me, I was not marked for the athletic field, sadly. I was always interested in stories. The first stories I heard that kind of caught my imagination were my grandmother telling me stories about my grandfather, who at that time had had a stroke. He would sit on his porch, he couldn't really communicate, so I never really knew him. And she would tell me these stories about how he had fled Russia on foot, how he was a motorcycle racer who went down the Khyber Pass in Afghanistan. And she would tell me these stories, I would look at him, and she suddenly unlocked this person for me. I could suddenly see him, I could hear his voice that I had never really heard before. So that was that was the moment that kind of keyed me into becoming a writer. Of course, then it's like a lifelong struggle to figure out how the hell do you actually do it.
So where did you grow up?
I was born in Manhattan, and then I grew up in Connecticut.
And were your parents involved in the writing world?
My mother was a very pioneering field in the publishing world. She was the first woman editor-in-chief of a major publishing house in New York, and then the first CEO of a publishing house.
And she said, I want you to be a writer?
No, just the opposite. She said to me, I only have one piece of advice for you. Whatever you do, don't become a writer.
Okay.
I think she never said why. I think she thought it would be a hard life. And of course, like any good son, I did the exact opposite and tried to become a writer.
So you went to college at Connecticut College?
Yes.
And graduate school at Tufts?
Yep.
And then what did you do right after Tufts? Did you say, I want to go work at the New Yorker or something like that?
No, when you're a writer, you try to figure out what you're going to do. So then I taught creative writing for 1 year at BU. And then I was desperately looking for a job, and I found a job actually here in DC at the Hill newspaper. It was just a startup. They hired me as a copy editor, which if anyone knows me, even as a writer, grammar is not my strength. I also have an eye disorder. that makes it very hard for me to see. So I was a failure as a copy editor, and as always happens in these situations, thus got promoted to executive editor within a year.
But your mother never said, how about becoming a lawyer, a doctor?
Oh,
something
she wanted a lawyer. In fact, the reason I went to the Tufts Graduate School, the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, because I thought that would appease them, because it had law in the title.
All right, but you never considered something important like private equity, right?
No, my kids now wish I had.
So you eventually you wind up and going to the New Yorker, right?
Yes, eventually I get to New York. It's a long, winding trail. It was the place I always wanted to work at because they did these narrative stories like I like to tell, and they let you tell stories that are sometimes, at least the ones I tell, a bit eccentric.
All right, so you're writing for the New Yorker, and you write. They give you a year to write a piece or 6 months to write a piece, and then you write it, and no big deadline. You eventually keep telling, I'm not done yet, and eventually you write the pieces, and your pieces are well.
Yes. Well, I just have to correct you on one point there. You get this from David Remnick, who's a friend who I dearly admire and like, but you get this a lot walking by your office, looking at his watch. As it goes, I was famously always slow and tardy.
Okay, so when did you get the idea that you could actually write a book as opposed to articles for the New Yorker?
In a weird way, I think the way I work, even at the New Yorker, was more suited for books because I would spend so much obsessive time reporting. I would want to know everything about a story. And so sometimes I would spend a year on a project. But it was finally, I did a story for the New Yorker about a British explorer who in 1925 had disappeared in the Amazon with his son. And when I finished that piece for the New Yorker, I actually did a trip into the Amazon trying to follow on his trail. When I told my editors about the plan, and they said, sure, go try to chase the trail of an explorer who disappeared in the Amazon nearly a century ago, and other people who had disappeared trying to find him. And they said, Godspeed. I thought that was their way of wanting to get rid of me. Took out an extra insurance policy on my life, but that's another story. But I did that, and when I finished that story, it was the first time where I just had so much more material. I had made a trip out to England, and I had tracked down this explorer, Percy Fawcett's granddaughter. And at one point she said to me, do you want to know what really happened to my grandfather? And I said, sure, if at all possible. And she led me into this back room. And in this back room, there was this chest. It was like something out of I swear, it was like out of some Victorian novel. There was a chest. She opened it up, and inside were all these old books covered in mud. The bindings were breaking apart. Some had little locks. I said, what are those? She said, oh, those are my grandfather's secret diaries and log books. And she let me look at them, but it would take me years to be able to read them carefully. He wrote in this small language and to be able to decipher them. And so when I finished that magazine piece, I knew I had so much more, and that's when I decided to write the book, The Lost City of Z.
Okay, so when you write a book, do you write and research, or you just do all the research and then write? How do you do that?
I begin doing just research, and I begin like this. I want to see everything, because when you begin a story, you really don't, you have some sense of what the story is, but you don't know what the dimensions or the hidden dimensions of the story. And I've had stories take complete right turns while researching them. So you begin like this, trying to read everything, and then slowly you begin to narrow it down. And what I will do is, at a certain point, I'll start, as I write chapters, I will take all the research I've done, outline it. That will also reveal to me what parts of my research is missing, where are the gaps, and then I'll do more research while I write.
So when you're writing, though, do you get writer's block and say, I just can't write today, and just go away and do something else, or do you never get writer's block?
Oh gosh, I get writer's block all the time. You know, I'm always amazed. I have some friends who I call them happy writers, and it's like some gene you're born with, like you go out for a jog and you get on your computer. I unfortunately am not the happy writer. For me, writing is a mystery that I cannot fully explain. I approach it every day the same. I treat it like a job. I sit on my tush. I go into the desk. And you know, some days I'll come out with 500 words that are good, and some days I will have rewritten the same sentence all day.
But you feel like you've accomplished something if in a given day you've done 500 words or 1,000 words?
500 words is my goal. I want to try to write 500 words
And then when
a
you
day.
go and look at the next day, do you say these are 500 terrible words, or do you always like what you wrote the previous day?
That's the happy or unhappy writer. I'm the unhappy writer. I look at the 500 words and I will say 200 words are good, and I'll rewrite the other 300, which is why it takes me years to write these books. It's, you know.
Well, when you're writing, before you became a famous writer, I assume you had an editor who would say, look, I can edit your books, but now you're a famous writer. Do you have editors tell you they can edit better than you can write?
Well, there's a famous story about an editor and writer, which is the editor and the writer are stuck in the desert, and they're dying of thirst, and they're marching along, and suddenly they see an oasis, and they crawl to the oasis, and the writer gets down and he puts his face in the water to drink it, and then the editor, excuse me for being a little profane, begins to pee into the water, and the writer says, "What are you doing?" He says, and the editor says, "I'm making it better." But I am blessed. I say that as a joke because I am blessed to have great editors. And there are writers who insist they don't need editors. I need an editor, and often more than one editor.
Okay, so let's talk about The Wager.
Yes.
So The Wager is a story, we'll go through the story, but how did you first hear about this? And do you go down a lot of rabbit holes before you actually find a story that's going to work for you in a book?
Yeah, the hardest thing is finding the right idea for a book, especially when you know you're going to spend so much time on it. You need something that's gripping, but also has other dimensions, has materials that will allow you to tell it. In this case, I was doing research on mutinies. I'd finished Killers of the Flower Moon. I was looking for a new book project. And while I was looking for mutinies on the computer, doing some research, looking at books, I found myself in a digital archive from England where I found a scanned book that was an account written by a 16-year-old midshipman from The Wager. His name was John Byron. If his name is familiar, it's because he would later go on to become the grandfather of the poet Lord Byron. And this was his description of what had happened. Now, I must confess, when I was first looking at the account, it was written in this old stilted English. The S's were printed as F's, but I kept pausing over these very arresting descriptions: mutiny, murder, scurvy, cannibalism, although he would refer to it as that last extremity. And I realized that this account was really one of the most gripping things I'd ever come across. But it was only later, I then spent months more to answer your question, is there enough there? And I answered the question, there were a lot of materials, but the thing that really interested me is I found there were all these other competing accounts from survivors.
But you're looking for a story, if I take it right, that's not well known, that you can develop details that will be very interesting to people, but it has kind of a novel-like story to it. In other words, you want something that's like a novel in the way that it unfolds. Is that right?
Yeah, very much so. I'm looking for something that is rooted in it's all true. Everything.
Why do you not just write a novel?
You know, it's funny. I would be a bad novelist. It's a great question. I actually did when I was younger. I tried to write, and I wasn't very good at it. And for me, what I am best at, you kind of find the writing that suits you over time. I wrote some bad poetry. I wrote a bad novel. What I am good at is excavating.
Right, so
I excavate. I try to find, the story is there, and I try to find it beneath it all.
On The Wager, by the way, The Wager has nothing to do with betting. It's basically the name. Where did the name Wager come from?
It was named after the admiral at the time. The head of the admiralty was named Sir Charles Wager, and this ship was named after him. But it's felt like a perfect metaphor because in many ways they are all gambling with their lives on this expedition.
Set the tone where this is coming from. What is the point of having The Wager go to where it goes, and explain what the purpose was and where does it go?
Yeah, so it takes place in 1739. Great Britain had gone to war with its imperial rival Spain, and The Wager and the men of The Wager are given orders to go on a secret mission with a squadron of ships, 4 other warships and a scouting sloop, to go across the Atlantic, then around Cape Horn at the tip of South America, and then all the way into the Pacific to try to intercept a Spanish galleon that was filled with so much treasure and plunder, it was known as the prize of all the oceans.
But how could they plan something that was going to take a year to get there? How would they know that that ship would be there?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the ship would travel twice a year from Mexico to the Philippines, carrying all the kind of stolen silver and gold and jewels from Latin America, bring it over to Asia to purchase Asian commodities. So it was a central link in its travel. So twice a year they knew it would go. They had estimations of the time, but they didn't know exactly.
Okay, so this is, how long is the voyage on the Wager and its accompanying ships going to take? A year or more?
No, they were expected to be gone, if everything went well, as long as 3 years.
3 years. So what kind of person signs up to go on a 3-year ship voyage?
So what's interesting about these ships is they were like floating civilizations. You would have people from all walks of life, the aristocrats, who would be the officers and dandies. You would have city paupers. You would have free black seamen. You'd have
no women?
no women. No women at that time period.
What about animals?
Oh, they would bring a farm's worth of animals. And most crazily is they were short of men. It was a problem with the Navy, British Navy back then, because they did not have conscription. So they were always short of volunteers. And so one of the things they did for this expedition was they sent out the press gangs. And these press gangs would go to towns and ports, and they would basically eyeball you for any telltale sign that you were a mariner. And if you had even a little tar under your fingertips, that meant tar was used on ships. They would seize you. They would, in effect, kidnap you and drag you unwillingly on this expedition.
And they pay people when they get on the ship?
They would get paid. They would get paid for the voyages in increments.
How do they actually pay them? You're on a ship for 3 years. You get Apple Pay or something?
You would get some advance pay, and then you would wait for something like this. You would be paid. Most of your wages would come at the end of the voyage.
Okay, so you're on for 3 years. And what the average age of somebody goes on one of these ships is what?
Well, generally on the younger side, but you would have people from all ages. You would have boys who would be training to become seamen or officers. They would be as young as 6. The captain on the Wager was in his 80s. And when the Navy was so short of men, even after the press gangs went out, they actually went to a retirement home and they began to seize soldiers and seamen, many of whom were in their 60s and 70s, some who were missing an assortment of limbs.
And would 74 be considered young?
74 for this, they would have taken you. You ready to go? We're off.
Okay. All right. So the ship, when does it take off from England?
It left in 1740 in September.
All right. So it goes, and how long does it take to get to the south of Latin America, the Cape of...
It takes several months for them to get to the tip of South America.
And the tip of South America is easy to navigate through, right?
Oh, no. Oh, no.
What's the problem?
No, that is the roughest seas in the world. The Cape Horn is a place where the seas travel around the globe uninterrupted, never blocked by land. So they accumulate enormous force. You will get winds that can reach 200 miles per hour. You will get waves that can dwarf a 90-foot mast, and you have the strongest currents on Earth.
Okay,
and they hit it all.
So did they get shipwrecked, or what happened?
So the squadron gets into the Horn. They've already faced an outbreak of scurvy. Hundreds and hundreds of them have perished. They have barely enough people
How many people are on this whole expedition?
Nearly 2,000.
2,000. How many ships?
There were 5 warships and a scouting sloop.
So 5, 6 ships. But like the Wager itself, how long was that? Was that 200 feet, 300 feet?
123 feet, with 250 people packed on board.
And did they each have their own accommodations?
They sleep in hammocks side by side, and when they rock, their elbows and knees would jostle. Unless you were an officer, in which case you had a little private quarter. The captain had what was known as the Great Cabin.
And if you did something bad, did they whip you or something like that? Or is that common those days?
So the tyrannical captains would use the lash. The most effective captains tried not to use the lash.
All right, so they get to the Cape of South
America.
South America. And then what happens there?
So they're in this storm, they're being battered left and right, they can barely, they can't even fly their sails because they keep blowing out. At one point, one of the captains orders his men to climb the masts about 100 feet up, to holding on to the ropes and to use their bodies as sails, concave sails. They are holding on in a gale. And
did that work?
Well, it did allow him to steer. They're holding on and they're rocking also like this, about 45 degrees to one side, 45 degrees to the other side. It did allow them to steer, but one of the seamen fell into the sea and drowned.
All right, so when,
Yeah, I never answered your question though. They all scatter. They all scatter around Cape Horn. They're in this storm, they're being battered, and eventually two ships turn back. The Wager gets separated and is left to its own destiny.
all right, what is its destiny?
Not a good one. This is the kind of story when right when you think everything couldn't get worse, things get worse. It was under a new captain, a man named David Cheap. He's determined to get around the Cape and then head up the coast of South America off the Chilean coastline to a place where the commodore of the expedition had said if they were ever separated, they should rendezvous. But he was plagued by the same problem that plagued seamen back then, which is he didn't know exactly where he was on the map. They could determine their latitude by reading the stars, but they had no way of knowing their longitude because they did not have clocks back then that were reliable. And they turn out, as they going up the coast of Chile, they realized that not only had they gotten their longitude wrong, they had gotten it wrong by hundreds of miles. They had relied on what was known as dead reckoning. And suddenly they find themselves in this bay known as El Golfo de Penas, which translates as the Gulf of Sorrows, or as some prefer to call it, the Gulf of Pain. They hit a submerged rock, the rudder shatters, a 2-ton anchor falls through the bottom of the hull. Now you have to understand, these ships were their homes. Most seamen back then did not even know how to swim. Suddenly another wave comes and it takes the boat, the vessel, sweeps it off the rocks, and so the vessel, the Wager, is careening through a minefield of rocks with no rudder to steer by, water pouring into it until at last it smashes into a cluster of rocks and begins to break apart. It completely shatters, the decks are caving in, water is surging in through the bottom, rats are scurrying upward. Those who had been suffering from scurvy, who could not get out of their hammocks, drowned. But the ship did not completely sink yet. It became wedged between these pillars of rocks, and it was then that some of the seamen, including the 16-year-old midshipman John Byron, they climb up on the remnants of the ship and they look out in the distance, and that's where they see a desolate island.
So how do they get to the island?
They used one of the transport boats that these vessels, they didn't carry lifeboats back then, but they had a few transport boats, essentially like rowboats. They could also fly a sail. They are able to use one of them to ferry about 140 of them onto the island.
All right, so 140 go on these ships, and the other people who are on the Wager, they die?
They died.
All right, so 140 people get to island, and now they're safe. And does the island have a lot of food and a lot of other good things for a good life?
Yeah, well, they hope this maybe this will be their salvation, but the island turns out to be desolate and barren. It's got mountains that go up about 2,000 feet. It's windy, it's cold, it's constantly raining or sleeting. They have no shelter, and worst of all, they can find virtually no food. There are no animals on the island. They find some mussels along the shore, but they soon exhaust them. They do find a little bit of wild celery, which actually cures their scurvy, but that's about it. And one British officer described the island as a place where the soul of man dies in him.
So is the captain, Captain Cheap, is he in charge now? He says, okay, I'm still in charge?
Yeah, so Captain Cheap believes if they are going to survive, they must live by the same rules and order that had governed on the ship. He was somebody who had always wanted to be a captain, and this was his first time. He had been promoted to captain on this voyage, and he is determined to hold on to it. But slowly, as they are starving, they begin to break down and descend into disorder and to break into these rival factions.
And so they're fighting with each other, and Captain Cheap, is he not in control anymore?
So there is one group that is wandering the island that breaks off. They are known as the seceders, and they just wander the island like pillaging. There is a small group that remains loyal to Captain Cheap, and then there is another group that is gravitating towards the gunner of the ship, a man named John Bulkley. They all have great names. They're like Dickensian names. There's Bulkley and Cheap, Byron. So Bulkley is a really interesting figure because he came from the lower to middle classes. He was very literate, though. He knew, though, on a ship, he could never become a captain in that rigid class structure. But he was a very instinctive leader. He was a very skilled seaman. And suddenly on this island, in this democracy of suffering, he is emerging as a commander in his own right. And more of the people are gravitating towards him. And us being in D.C., it's kind of interesting. He would use phrases. This is what the phrases he would stir the men with: life and liberty.
Right. So how do they ultimately get back to the mother country?
It's a long story, and I'll try to keep it somewhat short because there are different groups that leave. But they build a castaway boat very ingeniously, using fragments of the transport boat. They expand it, they get wood, they salvage stuff from the wreck, and eventually they build the ship. And many of them, there are more than 60 of them, packed so tightly they can barely even move. And they end up traveling some 3,000 miles all the way from the coast of Chile down through the Strait of Magellan to Brazil. And they wanted to get to Brazil because they knew they were at war with Spain. So if they got to Brazil, which was Portuguese, they wouldn't be in prison.
What kind of food did they have for that ship?
They had virtually no provisions.
How did they eat?
So they would try to get as close to the shore as possible with a boat, and then have some of the people, if they could, in the seas wade ashore to get some food. But they get very little, and when they arrive in Brazil, there are only 30 of them remaining. Their bodies are almost wasted to the bone, and they stand up and they announce, they are the survivors of His Majesty's ship, the Wager. And at first, it's almost impossible to believe because everybody believed the ship had sank. And they're initially greeted as heroes. But then months later, another little boat will wash ashore, this time on the other side of South America with some of the other survivors, including Captain Cheap, who was delirious at that point. But when he recovers, he tells a very different story. And he says, those people who have gone to Brazil, they aren't heroes, they're mutineers. And that will eventually, when they get back to England, they are summoned to face a court-martial for their alleged crimes on the island, including murder and cannibalism and whatnot. And this will spark a furious war over the truth.
So that eventually, how many people make it back to England?
About 40.
40. And how many people started on the 6 ships?
Nearly 2,000.
2,000. So,
and out of those, more than 1,300 of them perished on the voyage.
so did some of them wind up living in Latin America for the rest of their lives? Or?
Well, some of the other ships would come back, eventually come back
okay.
from some of the other ships. From the Wager, though, it's only about, actually it's less than 40 that make it back.
Less than 40 come back from the Wager. Then there's a trial, an Admiralty Court trial, and without giving away the results, basically, this went on for how long?
So this will go on. They are summoned, and again, what I found so interesting, and when you asked me earlier, when you look for a book, what do you look for? It's not just the specifics of a story, not just the facts. This was an incredibly gripping story, one of the most gripping stories of survival I'd come across. I thought it said something about the human condition, but what really intrigued me was when they get back to England, they are desperate to save their lives. They fear after everything they've been through, they could be hanged. So what they do is they begin to release their accounts, their version of Twitter. They begin to issue their tweets, which are their journals and their logbooks, and they are all trying to shape their story to emerge as the hero of their own story. And so there are these wonderfully competing versions of what really transpired. And so here I would be going to these archives in England where you can actually find these accounts, these journals that are somehow survive shipwreck and going around the world and tidal waves, and you can read them. And as you read them, you're reading about, disinformation and allegations of misinformation, and I swear to God, there are allegations of fake journals. And then I was coming back home, and I would turn on the TV or I'd read the newspaper, and I'd hear stories about alternative facts and fake news. And then I would go back to the archive, and they were having a battle back then over who would get to tell this history. Who had the right to tell this history? Should just the authorities, should just the captain, or could someone like Bulkley did he have a right to tell the history? And they're having this furious battle. And then, of course, she would come home and we were having a furious battle. So I saw all these resonant themes of the present day.
Are there any descendants of Captain Sheep?
There are actually. There are some descendants. I mean, by the end, I kind of would know, I think, more than any of the descendants did. But yes, there are. There's a descendant of the Commodore of this expedition.
Okay. And all right, so you finish the book. When you finish the book, you turn it into your publisher. And does your publisher say this is going to be a bestseller?
No, I don't think they ever say those words. It's like, no, it's like they try not to, you know, they usually, the best line an editor ever gave me before a book came out was said, when I was all anxious before the book came out, he said, this is the storm before the calm.
Okay. All right, so this book came out and you're going to sign copies of this book after
Yes.
this session. Okay.
Yes.
Let's talk about another book you've done, Flowers of the...
See, I try to come up with a title that no one can pronounce.
Yes.
And it's funny, people will come up to me and they're like, the moon flower, the flower, it's Killers of the Flower Moon.
Killers of the Flower Moon.
Yes.
Okay. Now, what does that mean?
So interesting enough, this is a story about the systematic murder of members of the Osage Nation in the early 20th century who had become among the wealthiest people because of oil under their land, and then they began to be serially killed. And the Osage have, they name each month after a moon. And the month of May, or April now, my mind is going, April, May, is the little flower killing moon, because during that time period, all these little beautiful flowers spread over the prairie. They look like confetti. They're little bluettes and they're very beautiful. But then the taller plants come and steal their water and all these beautiful little flowers die. And so I wanted to have the title of the book rooted in the Osage tradition, and it felt like a metaphor.
Right.
So I called it
And how long did it
Killers
take
of
you
the
to
Flower Moon.
research that book?
Both these books took half a decade.
And how did you hear about this incident?
A historian had mentioned this to me, but he didn't know much about it. I couldn't find much about it, so I made a trip out to the Osage Nation, Oklahoma. And at that time, I wasn't sure if I would write a book. I had no plans to write a book. And I made a visit out to the Osage Nation Museum, and they had this great photograph on the wall of that museum. It was taken in 1924. I'm struggling with dates as I get older. It had members of the Osage Nation along with white settlers, and it looked very innocent. But I noticed that a portion of this photograph was missing, and I asked the museum director, Catherine Redcorn, what had happened to it. And she said it had contained this figure so frightening, she had decided to remove it. And then she pointed to the missing panel, and she said the devil was standing right there. And it turned out to be one of the killers of the Osage during this time period. And that was really the origin story for that book.
The essence of the story is that Native Americans are given some land, and it turns out there's oil under the land.
Well, let me correct you there. What's interesting is they were not given that land. They had been on a reservation in Kansas.
Okay.
They were driven off their lands there under siege, and they had then looked around for new land, and they had found an area in what was then Indian Territory about the size of Delaware, and it was rocky and hilly, so they thought white people would finally leave them alone, so they decided to relocate there. But they purchased that land.
They purchased it.
They had a deed to it.
And it turns out that there's a lot of oil under this.
Yeah, this
and
place they thought was worthless turns out to be sitting
and
on all
the
this oil.
white people living around there, Anglo-Saxons, said, wait, this is not something that Native Americans should have. We should have it for the white people, and we should eliminate these people's ownership, in effect. And they began a process of trying to kill some of these owners. Is that right?
Yes, and it was more than just one person. And there really was a systematic campaign carried out by almost the whole society.
And the people who were behind the killing of it, were they ultimately caught?
Very tragically, only a few. Some of the leader, in fact, the devil, the so-called devil, was caught, and a couple of his henchmen. But in fact, I made a trip out to, when I first began researching that book, I thought of that story as about a singular evil figure and a couple henchmen who had committed these crimes. And that was the theory that the FBI that had investigated the case, was among its first homicide investigations, believed. But over time, the more I was out there and I spoke to Osage and learned about other suspicious deaths, and they would give me records, the more I realized that there were all these other cases. And I made a trip out to a branch of the National Archives in Fort Worth, Texas. And when I was there, I was pulling records on the guardianship system. And the guardianship system was a very racist system in which Congress had required members of the Osage Nation or wealthy to have white guardians to manage their fortunes. And so I was doing research on this guardianship system, and I was trying to confirm just a very simple fact about whether a certain Osage had had a certain guardian. And as I pulled these records out, I found a little booklet. It looked like a little ledger like that you would find in a hotel where you write your name. And all it was a list of a guardian and whose Osage fortunes they had managed. And the only other thing written in this booklet was the word dead if one of them had died. And I noticed under one of the guardians, they had had 5 Osages whose fortunes they had managed. And I noticed the word dead next to the first name, then dead, dead, all 5. And I thought, that's so strange. And then I began looking through this book, and I saw another guardian who managed about a dozen Osages' fortune, and they had 50%, about 50% listed as dead. And on it went. Now, many of these deaths were no doubt from natural causes, but it defied any natural death rate. The Osage had money, they had health care. And as I began to look into some of these deaths, I would find evidence of complaints about poisonings and murders. And I soon realized that this little anodyne book really contained the hints of a systematic murder campaign.
But some of the killers were found, right, and they were punished. But is your book about the fact that not everybody who deserved to be found as a killer should have been found?
Yes, and that's why that book was so key, because I would trace back some of these and find evidence,
Right.
and I began to realize that this was less a story about who did it than who didn't do it. It was really about a culture of killing, and you had policemen who were on the take and prosecutors, you had guardians who were complicit, you had morticians who would cover up bullet wounds. You had doctors who administered poison.
Now, all authors want to have a bestseller, but it's very rare to have 2 of your books on the bestseller list simultaneously. Right now, both of these books we talked about are on the bestseller list. So you ever pinch yourself and say, how did I get so lucky?
I do. You know, when you write, and the real thank you is actually to you all and all the readers out there. You know, when you write, it's a very lonely, as you know, it's a lonely endeavor. I spend years on these projects, and you know, the fear is that no one will read them, and so it is so gratifying to know. And the thing that ultimately drives you about all these stories I tell is there's something about the stories to me that are really important, that hold me. And so the idea that these stories then radiate out is incredibly
gratifying. Killers of the Flower Moon has been made into a movie.
Yes.
And I think it won the award at the Cannes Film Festival for the best film. And when is the film coming out?
The film will be out in October.
October. And you were played by Leonardo DiCaprio?
It's a very good question. They decided Leo wasn't handsome enough to play me.
Okay.
They're still trying to find the elusive Hollywood actor who could capture me in all my breath. Sorry.
You don't walk on as an extra anywhere? You're not an extra?
No, I'm not an extra, no.
And did Leonardo DiCaprio call you for some insights on how to do this?
You know, I will say I would receive calls from the various, some of the actors, DiCaprio, some of the production people. They had such a fierce interest and commitment to this story and getting it right. So they would call you, you know, it's mostly you're there as a resource for research, but you know, they would call you, you know, did the person walk with a limp? And often you're like, I have no idea.
So ultimately, the producer director, is that Scorsese?
Yes, Scorsese, yes.
And did he do so well with this that he called you and said, I want to do your next book?
Well, I was, you know, it's funny, you're always anxious when you turn these stories over to Hollywood, because the truth is you control a book, that's your thing. And then when you turn it over, you don't really control it. You like to think you do, but you don't. But I was so, the way they developed Killers of the Flower Moon And the way they work with members of the Osage Nation to develop that story and to get it right was so gratifying. And so when they called me and they said they were interested, when Scorsese and DiCaprio were interested in The Wager, it was a pretty easy decision on my part.
You don't ask to play a part in the movie or anything like that?
I think that would kill the deal in the spot. They would be like, yeah, that's one bridge too much. You know, the thing about being I'll give you a quick metaphor on a Hollywood production since we talked about ships. A ship is a very hierarchical organization, The Wager was. At the captain is the pinnacle. Then you have the lieutenant, then you have the top men who climb the mast, then you have the forecastle men who are very skilled, then you have the able seamen, then you have the ordinary seamen, and at the very bottom you have the landlubbers. The landlubbers know nothing about the ship, and they have to work alongside the animals on a ship. On a Hollywood production, that's the author.
Right. So now you're looking, I presume, to work on another book.
Yes.
Now, if people have good ideas for a book that you can write in your unique style, should they just send the idea to your publisher and say, here's a great idea for you?
davidgrant@gmail.com. Why? Don't go to anybody else. Come to me.
All right, so you get that. All right. And so right now you're gearing up looking for another story.
I am.
Okay. And so for somebody that's watching now and saying, or sitting here, I'd like to be David Grant. I'd like to be a writer.
You don't want to be David Grant, but you want to be a writer. Okay.
Be a writer. All right. What's the best thing to do? Is it to do well in English in high school? Is it to practice writing, be on the school newspaper? What's the best way to be a writer?
Yeah, I think two things. I think, and it's why we're here today, the real reason is reading. To read widely, to read people you like and even you don't like, to learn from the people you deeply admire, to see how they do it, to study language, to read music and begin to listen to it as music, to hear the words. So I think that is so important. You can't be a writer if you don't read. And then the other part, and it's the most prosaic advice you can give, but in some ways I think it is the hardest advice for people to follow, which is if you want to write, you have to write. And what that entails is actually the tedium of writing, which means you have to sit and to do it. And I always say to people, when you want to write, find any excuse to write. Don't find excuses not to write. So when I began writing, I wrote obituaries, I covered high school graduations, I wrote bad poetry, I wrote essays. You just write because, if you can write catalog for a cereal, write the catalog. Like, that is how you learn to write.
So how do you write longhand, or are you a computer person?
Well, for many years I did write longhand. I remember my first stories I wrote were actually, for journalism, I wrote in Mexico. I had a typewriter. There were no faxes back then. I would type up the story. I would get on a bus. I would ride 2 hours to get to the magazine. I would hand them the copy, and they would have to read it in front of me. And that was the old day. But now, yes, I use computers.
Okay, so do you ever push the wrong button and something escapes and you lose it?
Well, the worst moment for a writer, especially a technophobic writer like myself, is when there is any technological issue on a computer, like something starts to go haywire or it blacks out on you. Thankfully, I have a much smarter wife than I am, who's also technically gifted, who basically just kicks me out of the room and fixes everything. So while I just scream outside saying it's over, the world's coming to an end.
So my impression is the hardest people to impress with one's career is one's children. So are your children impressed with your books and they say, Dad, this is the greatest book ever, I can't wait to read the next one?
I will say, yes, impressing your children is really hard. Most days I'm just dad, or dad, duh, and I'm just a dork who is in his office looking at 18th century documents with a magnifying glass, half blind. But every once in a while something will happen. My son, who is an aspiring musician, he picked the one career harder than being a writer. And he actually read The Wager, and he found it so affecting or somehow, and he wrote a beautiful song called The Lost Souls of Wager Island. It's better than the book. It made the whole journey worthwhile. And then I will say this, my life doesn't really change, but every once in a while they'll make a movie of one of my projects, and I will bring my kids out to the set, and for about 2 days I am cool, and then it's just back to being just dad, duh, again.
So do you get any royalties on your son's song?
No, he gets all that. He's,
really?
he's got the harder job than I do now.
Look, your books are great. They're compelling to read. I congratulate you on having such a successful career. Thank you for coming here, and you're going to be out signing some books for people
Yes.
shortly. So, David, thank you very much
Thank
for
you
being
so
here.
much, David. Thank you. Thanks, David.